Welcome to the webinar by Pilkington NSG for low carbon glass, specifying for net zero. We're going to be discussing, how the glass industry is reacting to the increasing focus on net zero targets for the built environment, and how manufacturing glass can be more sustainable with less impact on our environment going forward. So my name is Jason Eggerton. I am the UK Specification Sales Manager for Pilkington NSG. I've been with the company around about 15 years in various roles in sales and technical. I'm joined by some industry colleagues. First of all, there is Graham Coult. So Graham is joining us from from Eckersley O'Callaghan. He joined in 2004. He has 20 years of professional experience and technical expertise in pioneering glass engineering. A continued interest in materials. Has been instrumental in delivering the Eckersley's many challenging and award-winning projects. So as Technical Director, Graham is responsible for the strategic operations across the company. So defining the design processes and project delivery for project excellence. He also leads the research and development program, driven by a pursuit to explore the innovative, sustainable and circular use of materials in design. So currently Graham is part of a 2-year research project and continues to work closely with the glass industry and the glass supply chain. The aim of that research is to drive the circularity in the glass industry and address the potential of flat glass to endlessly recycle without degrading in quality. I'm also joined by Aston Fuller from Glass Futures. So Aston is the General Manager of Glass Futures. He's responsible for the day-to-day running of Glass Futures and to ensure that the activities carried out across the programs align with industry trends and technology and direction. Aston has worked in the glass industry for 10 years. He has spent 8 years with Ardagh Glass, gaining experience in furnace management, operational maintenance, capital construction, wider plant engineering, energy management, before working with British Glass and GTS on wider cullet recycling projects prior to joining Glass Futures. He's got a keen interest in entrepreneurship and innovation, especially in relation to sustainability. Aston has over the past few years developed a passion for driving change in sustainable engineering, manufacturing and helping open knowledge of the glass industry to younger generation of engineers. And then finally, a colleague of mine, Andy Keeley. So Andy is one of our team leaders in manufacturing technology within Pilkington NSG R&D team. He provides technical support to manufacturing sites worldwide in the area of furnace commissioning, operational support and process improvement projects. He has worked with Pilkington NSG for 35 years and across the range of R&D and manufacturing roles. Andy's also the leader of the Alternative Fuels project within the decarbonisation portfolio within R&D. This project has delivered industry firsts with trials firing with hydrogen on the float furnace, and also the first full furnace trial of biofuel on the float furnace as well. He continues to develop alternative fuel options, aiming to deliver carbon reductions in line with the NSG targets. So I'm going to be obviously asking a few questions to some of these industry experts One thing I will invite you to do on the chat function is if you've got any particular questions, we will have time at the end to ask questions to these guys. If you want the question directed at a particular person, just put that in the chat that you would like a particular person to answer it, and then I'll bring on board one of my colleagues, James, who will to help manage the Q&A at the end. So to kick off, I think it's a question first to Graham. I'll go with you first, Graham. Okay. So sustainability has been a big part of the projects that you deliver for your clients from an energy efficiency perspective. But to what extent is the specification of low carbon materials now creeping into that conversation more with your clients? I'm assuming now that your clients are now raising this topic with you more. So it'd be interesting to see how that's been, how you dealing with these challenges.
Yeah, I think over the last year since signing the climate emergency agreement, the structural engineers declare, it's become larger and larger. I think so. I think we've been aware of the issue for a while, but having the tools and the knowledge to enable us to provide assistance and consultancy to the clients, whether it's the developers, the architect, or whatever, it wasn't there. So there's been a lot of work in the past 2-3 years, mining the industry for what there is and where there isn't any information, trying to come up with our own. And so we're just really, still we've created tools, and they will continue to develop, with as the information comes on board. But in terms of awareness, it's still, I think, largely we tend to be pushing the agenda more from a design side rather than top down at the moment. We do get clients who that's an indicator, but a lot of our commercial clients still, that they don't have the awareness or knowledge to enable them to make those decisions. So when they come into a project, because of that uncertainty, they don't choose to pursue it. And I think that will change as education moves out. But we see it as our role just really to lay out those options of what is possible. We've always been designing things to be delightful and fun, and or speed of construction or whatever those performance indicators might be. But this sort of low carbon or sustainable or circularity, whatever the sort of target we're looking at, has now come on as one of the major indicators that we're trying to help the client with and bring some understanding and clarity to that, because it's a very confusing sphere at the moment.
It is. Yeah, well, yes, it definitely is. I mean, that moves on to a question for Andy. Part of making glass more sustainable in buildings, one of the topics is obviously using more cullet in the manufacturing process. What impact does using more cullet in glass manufacturing? How can you see it being used more in the future as well?
Yeah, I think in terms of glass recycling in general in the container industry, it's quite widespread now, and we often are up at 70-80% recycled content in containers. So, but I think one of the challenges for the flat glass industry is the quality specifications that we need to work to. So, people like to look through windows rather than at them. So I think one of the challenges is to make sure that we can maintain our quality specifications when we do recycle more cullet into our process. I think in terms of we already do a fair amount of internal, so our secondary processing, we return quite a bit of glass back from that. The challenge is really taking external cullet where obviously the risks go a little bit higher. and we are increasing the amount of external cullet that we are using. But you know, we do need to be very confident in the quality of the cullet that we're using. So I think a lot of it is about education. It's about people understanding what they need and what we need in terms of the quality of the cullet that we are feeding back into the process. But obviously, you know, the more cullet we use, the less energy we use. So it's always a good thing to maximize the amount of cullet that we're actually using. So I think going forward, there will be more and more recycling, especially, you know, with kind of more end of life initiatives with buildings trying to extract the glazing before the demolition comes into place. So, you know, there are some interesting things out there which will allow us to recycle more glass.
Andy, and what's interesting topic there. I mean, I think moving manufacturing to be even more sustainable, it's not just about the cullets as well. There's also there's a transition obviously to low and zero carbon fuels. What can you tell us about the innovations that have recently happened around that? Yeah,
well, we've obviously been involved in quite a few developments over the last 18 months, really. We carried out the first trials firing hydrogen as a fuel on our furnaces in the summer of 21. So there we carried out effectively two sets of trials. The first set was basically looking at what percentage hydrogen we can get to as the maximum on a single port on our furnace, and we managed to get to 100% hydrogen firing, and we were getting effective melting with firing that fuel on that port. So that was successful. The second set of trials, or the second trial we did with hydrogen, was looking at firing 15% hydrogen on the whole of the furnace. So this was looking in anticipation of hydrogen being fed into the grid in the northwest of England, which is proposed to be up to 20%. And we carried out a 5-day trial at 15%, just to prove that our systems could actually cope with that. And again, that was completely successful. The reason we didn't do 20% was basically because there isn't enough hydrogen available at the moment. So, you know, it's not until we end up with, you know, large scale generation and pipeline delivery that we will be able to fire hydrogen in earnest. But it is actually interesting that in the northwest of England, we are in a situation with the HyNet project that they are looking, or that the actual pipeline for the hydrogen in the northwest is already out for public approval. So the public consultation on that hydrogen pipeline is ending, I think, at the end of this month. So we are in a situation where, you know, this is very real. There will be large-scale hydrogen generation, and there will be, at least in the northwest of England, a hydrogen pipeline available. So outside of hydrogen, we've also carried out trials with bio-oils. So these were also successful. We carried out trials over a 4-day period while we were firing the bio-oils without any impact on product quality. So there are viable options we've got out there to decarbonize our combustion processes in terms of manufacturing glass, and potentially reducing our CO2 by around 65% of the glass, embodied CO2 in the glass that we manufacture, with the rest coming from the raw materials. So I think there's plenty of scope out there at the moment.
Yeah, certainly sounds like some great progress and some good news for the future as well there. Andy, so Aston, this touching on some of the things that Andy just raised there about cullets and fuel, two different things that influence the amount of embodied carbon in glass. Is there potentially an issue here of of what the industry defines as low carbon glass?
Yeah, I think when you look across the board, we're at that precipice point where the market has recognised that this product exists, but it's still sort of fresh out the box, and there isn't a legal definition or a legal specification of what is low carbon glass. And I think this is the real challenge, because there's a number of different factors that ultimately can influence the amount of embodied carbon in a piece of glazing, and at what level of embodied carbon per kilogram of glass do we actually classify something as low carbon. Is there a medium carbon glass? Is there an ultra low carbon glass? And I think this is what we're at, that point where we know it exists, and people have started asking about it, and people have started exploring what it might look like on the marketplace. But we're really at that starting point overall. So Graham talked about the challenges and building tools and assessments internally. I think as a whole, the industry over the course of the next several years will ultimately come to a point of specification or understanding as to what does it mean to be low carbon. And when you talk about circularity, would you have to specify that to call something low carbon, it has to have an end of life plan or something along those lines? So we don't know. I think we're at that point in the industry where we know it's going to be a thing, but we're not there yet. We haven't specified it. We haven't sat down as a group and come up with a BSI or an ISO standard that says this is what it's classified as. So we're really at that. We're at that tipping point, I suppose, where we know it exists, we know people want it, and we really, understanding what it looks like and defining it is going to be important. So we move away from, it being a discussion about what something is, and actually being able to say, I specify this, and come and show me the figure that shows me it conforms with the specification that I give you. And we're not there yet at the moment. The industry's got some way to go, I think, into understanding what it really is. So
yeah, thanks, Aston. Just moving on from that, Graham, from your side, from your industry that you're seeing, how important do you think it really is to have a standardised view of what low carbon glass is, rather than it being potentially like a marketing term? What's the view from?
Yeah, I mean, certainly from our aspect, it's critical, because if we're looking to specify a generic low carbon glass, well, we need to understand what that means. So it can go into the building life cycle analysis. So it can go into, we can understand the intensity of carbon within that and provide those figures for the auditory process. So I think that's a really it's a critical thing, and it's interesting how we might get to that point, because obviously delivering of your raw glass to your processors is, you don't have all the kite marks on there. At some point the kite mark has to go on about what it is, but then there's this level of auditory compliance which is quite fragmented, and so that also leads to difficulties as well. But I think a first point is understanding, first point is really just to improve the level of colour that's available with the from the current demolition processes, which we're not doing enough of.
No, I agree. No, we're not. No, certainly something that we probably do need to work on to try and just try for the future. Yeah, and
just to comment on that, Graham. I mean, I suppose this is I think the real challenge is what appears simple is actually the more you know, the more you realise you don't know, and actually the further detail you go into the supply chain, and when you ask this question around is something low carbon or not, it's actually, you realise that it's the raw materials that have gone in, including the amount of cullet available. It's the efficiency of the overall process for melting and manufacturing the glass. It's the fuels that you use that go into it. It's then also, when we talk about basic glazing, doesn't really have a value until you add a coating to it and then make it into a final product. Well, what's the embodied carbon involved in the coating process and the processing process? And actually, this is where you end up with the key challenge, is there's so many players in that whole supply chain that impact not just its embodied carbon, but also its recyclability. The information, does it go into a bin model overall? So what's the we talk about low carbon, but when we talk about the fact that we need cullet to make our glazing more low carbon in the first place, well, to get more cullet back, you need a circular model, and you need a supply chain that understands what impacts circularity as well. And I think sometimes it feels right to disaggregate and look at each section on its own, but really that, you know, the system is complex, and you have to look at the complexity of the system as a way to actually improve it overall. You can't simply look at the fuel that we use or the cullet level that we use, because in isolation it doesn't give you a true handle on the full life cycle carbon impact of the glazing. I actually I'm from the container industry, but I know when I was looking at they did the Burrell refurbishment. I know that's the video that Paul's referencing from British Glass. I went to visit, and they had some issues with some of the glazing, and they'd felt roofed over the glazing on the top of the building. You know, they literally sort of tar and felt straight over a glazing unit, and you sort of look at it and you think, you know, this the impact that you've had on this as a piece of glazing is just so much bigger than you think when you know. So it is a big challenge. So when we talk about specifying low carbon glazing, I think we also need to talk about, you know, specifying a whole system solution to resolve the current issue, but also the issue that we're going to have in 15, 20 and 30 years down the line. So
yeah, thanks, Aston. I mean, defining low carbon glass, what has the industry done? What progress is happening in the decarbonisation process, Aston? What's happening?
I think I mean, there's so much going on, and I think this is the true challenge. Like, every part of the process is under scrutiny, and I think one of the defining factors that we see above all else is a new willingness to approach things in a different way. You know, to try and find those areas where we can collaborate across different sectors, across different industries, and actually to try and find innovative solutions. I think a really good example, when you look at the construction sector in particular, is that the circularity of a glazing unit is about, you know, PVC, aluminium and glass recycling. It's not a glass recycling issue. It's an issue for glass, metals and chemicals. And actually, I think the new approach that we see is that, you know, these industries are willing to reach out and collaborate and find a point where, you know, where can we actually work together as common cross sectors, to actually find those solutions, and to a degree is to try and lower the cost of the innovation. There's a huge challenge in the, you know, the transition to where we need to be is going to be expensive, and if everyone does the work in parallel on their own, it will be very, very expensive, as opposed to, you know, working on a common platform where possible, and actually trying to reduce the cost and accelerate the impact overall. So, and personally, we see stuff all the way through the manufacturing process, but also in the whole supply chain as well, from, you know, customers, processors, suppliers, clients, that there really is a huge amount of momentum we see being gained. So, and, you know, I've lots of conversations with everyone on the call about these, you know, just these ideas and concepts around how do we actually approach this differently and collaboratively. So
yeah, it's good. I mean, actually being collaborative with manufacturers, central governments around, behind the scenes, is leading the way towards decarbonisation. Yeah. How do you see that developing in the future? How do we actually take the next steps? How do we actually move this forward?
Well, I think one of the challenging things is that I think we are doing it, and I can see it. I think the big difficulty that I see is that everyone is remarkably busy. You know, everyone's got a huge amount going on, and it's about, I suppose, dedicating the time and resource, and actually prioritising it. You know, making sure that it is a clear priority. And I mean, Graham, you're probably a lot closer to the, you know, clients and investors and other people, but in the conversations that I've had, you know, people are suddenly in the supply chain that have probably been quite far away and insulated from this conversation, you know, all of a sudden getting it on pieces of paper and being asked the question, well, you know, what can we do to make this X, Y, and Z? I know the public sector's moving towards being much more stringent and requiring things that haven't been required before. So there is that shift and that move, but I suppose it's doing everything we can to reach out to each other and try and collaborate and build momentum and give it the focus that it needs. Do you see that, Graham? I suppose from an investor and from a client perspective, is there a bigger pressure?
Yeah, I think that certainly there's interest there, and I think that there's certainly no lack of demand for it. It's really it's a supply that we're missing, because certainly from bringing the glass back from buildings and putting it back into the supply chain, it's happening on a very small scale, and there's some very enterprising individuals doing that. But that's not going to really get us to the point where we need to be in terms of increasing those tonnages by a factor of 10, 20, 30 over the coming years. But there's the impetus there, and it is happening, and the collaboration is there. Obviously, we've got the work going on in St Helens, where that as an industry we've come together, across the supply chain, from the flat glass manufacturers, back up through demolition contractors and clients and glass processors, along with British Glass and Glazing Federation. I could go on, but I won't. But the important thing is, there's a joint responsibility and joint feeling of, we need to do something, and we're also involving Arup as well, which is, a very large practice. Because as part of signing this climate emergency agreement, we agreed to share the results and share that so we could move quicker. I mean, this shouldn't really be seen as, perhaps, in our terms, a service to a client. It should be something that's naturally done, because it shouldn't necessarily be competitive. It'd be something that we do, and so that has a very different feeling from our sort of typical research is, how can we do things better than the next person, which we're all doing to some sort of extent, but it's about showing those processes. And I'm encouraged by it. And what it frustrates me that it takes so long, but as you say, that people are busy trying to earn a crust, and there are other things going on. So it's around investment, making sure those resources are available to get this work done.
Just one other thing I wanted to touch on with you, Graham, and in Aston, please chip in if you've got any views on this. But see, with the amount of colour that's potentially the increased colour content within glass, what impact this has on potentially the aesthetics of glass. So you see a lot of architects, specifiers, they're automatically jumping to put low iron glass on all of their specifications. It's just that just seems to happen naturally. So there seems to be a bit of an education process now for us in the industry to move away from what is deemed acceptable for aesthetics from a manufacturing point of view. What feedback have you had on that, and what with the amount of colour, new fuels? What's your view on this education process, Graham?
Well, it is a very interesting point. In a lot of our projects, we do a lot of structural glazing, and we use very thick glass, and the use of low iron is really important, certainly for my clients to have clarity there. But for most of the glazing, it's certainly not a necessity. Particularly if you have coatings on, maybe we pick up the color a bit more. But I think, yes, there's there's a certain consideration that it's a higher quality product, so therefore we must provide it to our clients, without really understanding the impact it will have. So yeah, I think that there's a real sort of consideration to what does the quality of the glass mean to us, and if we increase the color, so the standard glass we were using 20-30 years ago with its greater iron content, if we start feeding that in, what happens to the standard float dirt is being produced, and you know, is that a real concern? I mean, I tend to feel it's not. You know, I think there's always going to be a market for lower iron glass, but I think, you know, there's certainly an argument to say, well, I guess what with the standard glass, what we call mid-iron glass now by a lot, is, well, you know, let's go back to where we were. What, you know, all perfectly happy. We weren't moaning about it. It's just that this other product was there. So, you know, I would be, you know, more than happy to have, you know, those products that we could specify in the knowledge that, you know, that it's making contribution to a lower energy product, and I think that, you know, that is more than acceptable. And you know, if anybody can really tell the difference, then they can say that, okay, I know why it's different, because it's a lower carbon glass. So I don't see a problem with it at all, and I would, you know, completely support that. But yes, education is key.
Yeah, I think you're right there. I think you touched very quickly on project, I think, which is quite close to you, is the St. Helens project. From a future, where do you see the opportunities, and where, you know, if you had to, you want to see, right, where would you like the industry to be in 5 years' time? That recycling centre. I mean, explain a bit more about that if you want to. But yeah, that's, you know, where do you see this developing and growing?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's so much that needs to be done, but I think a really good benefit of working with St. Helens, obviously at the home of glass, and I think working with the local council, we can really start to impact what happens through planning, because there's really no requirement to recover glazing from site. It's really down to client's preference, but because clients don't really know how much it's going to cost, architects tend to not to specify it, and so it doesn't get done. And then when a facade consultant, say like ourselves, comes along and says, well, this is great glass, we should take this off the building, get it back in supply chain, the demo contractor says, well, you know, I can't afford that. The client says, I've already signed the contract, so, you know, we're at a no-go. So learning how we can force the client's hand or encourage them to do the right thing, I think that's an essential step to you know, this first stage to unplug the process. But you know, I think awareness of what is available at the moment is the first thing we need to be doing, because there are waste carriers that specify with glass, there are glass reprocessors, and so we can do this now, but you know, there's just a lack of supply. But when we look, you know, towards the medium term, is, well, you know, when those tonnages increase, you know, what does the local and national infrastructure look like? Do we have enough glass reprocessors, and where are they located? And you know, what do these models look like? And you know, is it a sustainable business? And it'd be great if it was a sustainable business and someone pick up the reins, go, great, I'm going to invest in this, but I'm not so sure that that's going to be the case. So we need to work out how we can work with local government and you know, investors to make that happen, and show and fundamentally show that, you know, returning the glass and the amount of effort involved within that is of significant benefit. Because if we're, you know, transporting this around the country and it's not done efficiently, then all the benefits just go out the window, and we're throwing good money away. So, you know, we need to be able to demonstrate that, you know, this recovery process is working, both from a cost and a carbon issue point of view.
I think in terms of recycling, I think, you know, we can recycle up the kind of color stream. So, you know, when you are, if it's mostly hard to recycle reclaimed low iron glass into low iron glass manufacturing, because it's very hard to segregate, but you know, clear and low iron glass together can be recycled into clear glass manufacture, and can also be used for tinted glasses, you know. So you know, you can just recycle, but maybe not into exactly the same product. So I think there is quite a lot of scope for recycling colour, as long as it's clean enough.
Yeah, I think one piece, particularly on the specifying point, is definitely a bit of a bugbear. Now, I wasn't around at the time, but this is one of the old adages from the container industry, is that a well-known vinegar brand used to put their vinegar in any old colour bottle because it didn't matter. And then, you know, over the course of many years, actually, to make their brand stand out, and from a marketing perspective, they didn't want bottles that were slightly different colours. So all of a sudden, they started specifying that it needed to be a certain level of flint for the vinegar bottle. Now, the reality is, no one looks at a bottle of vinegar and says, bloody hell, that's a bit green, that bottle. So I think, and you know, for me, is a really good parallel there between, you know, are we specifying the right product in the right location? Because I don't think people really recognise the impact that specifying that product has from a sustainability perspective, from an energy consumption or an ability to recycle more colour, because the colour specification's a bit, you know, isn't low iron. And I think, you know, coming back to that question, this is a huge education piece, and sometimes I suppose a seeing is believing is quite important. So, you know, visiting the manufacturing sites, physically getting your hands on the colour and understanding what the challenges are. And I think that the industry can or should be doing a lot to connect people through the whole supply chain to the manufacturer, to the processors, so we actually understand what these constraints are. I don't think there will be a magic economically attractive button that everyone presses that just makes this whole thing go away. Like, this is going to be born of people understanding and putting good processes in place, training people to make sure they deliver the right messages and put good segregation onto construction sites. Like, this is a people solution that's needed. It's not a, you know, an autonomous robot that's just going to come and save everyone's lives over the course of the next 50 years, maybe in 100 years, but it'll be a bit too late by then, Jason. So a big education is needed for sure.
Yeah, I think you're right. Well, I know that you're right about the education process. I think from a glass manufacturer's point of view, you know, we talk about reusing more, using more cullet, post-consumer cullet from commercial buildings, for example. I think there's definitely more work that's needed in the not just the glass industry, but education to building owners, education to demolition companies, the actual cullet recycling. So I think there's definitely work. We're all moving in the right direction. We're making progress. Probably not as quick as everybody would like, but I think there is definitely progress being made within the industry. And I think there's more educational work that's needed throughout the whole supply chain of the construction industry. I personally feel there's opportunities to be had, particularly with glass recycling from the residential market. I think that there's definitely opportunity there to take glass from, obviously, people are having windows replaced at home and getting glass back from buildings. Then we're into trying to actually how do we actually encourage people to get the glass back from somebody's house or somebody's buildings back to a recycle centre? How do we actually make that happen? How do we make it worthwhile for these companies to deliver that glass back to St. Helens? Any views on that, Aston or Greg?
I think ultimately there's an education piece required, but there's also an infrastructure, a planning, a sort of public-private engagement piece of work. You know, there's a huge amount of institutions that have got, you know, an ability to legally specify. You know, planning departments all the way around the country can put conditions precedent on planning consents. So there are, you know, there's sticks and carrots, and I think the industry has to understand what they are and make sure that it brings people on the journey. You know, ultimately, when you look at contractors and demolition, you know, the last step should always be legislation. You know, you're legally bound to do this, and you don't have a choice. and it's forced across the whole industry. There's an opportunity, I think, to move before, but to do that we have to understand the psychology and all the different pieces that exist across that supply chain, from legislators, local councils, clients, R&D facilities, manufacturing facilities, processes, and I think a whole systems approach is the only real way. And it's no one's just going to do that for us. Like, the industry has to do it off its own back. It has to identify who the people are and actually engage in it. And coming back to the earlier point, assign the resources to do the work.
Yeah, and I'd say for the early adopters and for those willing to spend some time in research, I think that there's going to be some significant rewards there in developing that industry, because as I say, regulation is the last point. We need to make sure that the systems are there, but certainly we see sustainability. I mean, it's the whole industry that's growing that wasn't there previously, and so these things are going to need to be serviced. I mean, if we can show obviously that from an economic and carbon intensity perspective it's practical, but we will need to do it, and that's without a shadow of a doubt. So those who are early adopters are going to have a commercial advantage. I mean, certainly from when I spoke to demolition contractors, it gives them a particular advantage over the next person who won't be able to do that efficiently or doesn't know where the glass can go, and they can make an extra bit of cash by on selling that. So I think it's a really exciting part of creating or helping this industry bloom. It's a really good opportunity.
It is. Yeah, I think it's absolutely right, and it's something we've got to do. And as I touched on before, I think there's been some great strides from the glass industry, looking at increasing cullet content. You're looking at alternative fuels that are more obviously more sustainable, but I think there's still progress to be made, but we're all moving in the right direction. I think Aston makes some good points around trying to standardize or trying to define what low carbon glass needs to be. I think there's some work needed around that. Interesting to hear as well, Graham, that we're all part of it, the education for the building owners about what low carbon glass needs to be, needs to look like. I think there's definitely from an aesthetic point of view, I think there's all some great points being raised today. I think we're all acknowledged that there's more work to do, but there's still progress. The progress we've made today, I think, is good and all moving in the right direction. I'd just probably like to move on now to just bring in one of my colleagues, James, he's been having a look at some of the chats, some of the questions, and just to see what questions people are raising on the chat functions. If anybody's got any questions for you guys from the chat, James.
Thank you very much, Jason, and thank you guys for talking with us today. So yeah, we've had a few questions on the chat, and please keep them coming. We'll try and cover them all. So the first one goes back to Aston, you mentioning the non-low medium carbon, and as an industry, should we take the lead and define these things? Another question to do with this was, how do we get this done? One person suggested maybe it's one of the bodies, British Glass, Glass for Europe, GGF. Your thoughts on that, please?
I think the theory works. I think the true challenge around the practice is that it requires the whole supply chain to buy in, and we talk about the tracking of materials. I think this is the real challenge. You're producing jumbo sheets at most manufacturing locations that then go and get processed into smaller sheets of glazing at one of the many thousands of processes that exist, just within the UK, not even externally. So actually effectively tracking glazing through the whole supply chain is a technology that is needed without doubt to actually enable this work. So I think I think outlining the need and outlining the desire as an industry to push in that direction is always going to be the starting point. I think the barrier is that you need technology enablers to enable it to happen, so you don't end up with, you know, fraudulent systems or claims that can't be backed up. So, you know, we can discuss this specification and what it might look like, but actually implementing into a supply chain that's as complex as it currently is, I think is probably a much bigger and more difficult task than it probably would at first appear. You know, do you QR code every other inch of glazing to make sure that when it goes to a processors, no matter what way it's cut, there's a QR code on it? Or, you know, so everyone would need to be part of a scheme. The scheme would need to track all the glazing that exists all over the place. You know, imported glazing would have to be considered. You know, can you specify or can you force people in other areas to actually put what low carbon, what embodied carbon there is in the imported glazing? So I think you very quickly run up against a difficulty from a specification and legislative perspective. I think what we can do as an industry sooner rather than later is begin defining best practice and actually try and run and prove this with some of the really big players that can influence things, you know, on a relatively large percentage scale, you know, within their own. So, you know, take the top 5 glazes in the UK, for instance, and say, look, you know, can we start to put a scheme in place that captures a majority of the market and begins the conversation to talk about it? Because I think you know, it will definitely be an 80-20. I think getting that, the first 80% will be okay, but the rest of the 20% could completely upset the market because, you know, it might be falsely advertised or the figures might not be correct. So I think we need to define it so we know where we're headed, but there are big technology enablers that are also required to actually to make sure that the system isn't, you know, subject to fraud and the like. So
I would just add to that in the fact that generally, as specifiers, we look to EPDs to look at the carbon content, etc., of the product. And obviously, for most building products, they're fairly uniform. It's a single piece of one type. Whereas when we come to glazing, we have the raw glass. It's, as you say, it comes in, goes to processor. The efficiency of their machines may be different to theirs from another partner. We're putting in laminating materials, which have a huge variety. And so having an EPD specifically for a singular glass panel of a specification is not practical. And so we're looking at how we can look from industry sort of standard energy ratings of production to see what we can do with a carbon content, but to have that in terms of something that's audited, I think is probably insurmountable task at the moment, without a huge amount of technological innovation in the supply chain.
Thank you very much. So now going on to cullet. So what do float glass recyclers need to be able to supply? So basically, what they're asking is, what does the cullet need to be to go back into the float glass process again? Is there something in the fundamental design of glass, laminates, or even the IGUs that need to be changed to support post-consumer cullet?
And Andy, this one's got your name written all over it.
Okay, yeah. I think the main thing is it's about making sure it's clean. I think, as you say, if it comes from an IGU, it's going to have aluminium spacers and things like that in there. So we've got to make sure that we don't get any other materials coming back with the cullet, because aluminium is a bit of a killer for us. It tends to fizz in the furnace and generate a lot of faults. So, you know, that's just one. But, you know, any kind of remnants of brick dust or brick particles or things like that are all going to cause problems in the process. So ultimately, it's down to clean cullet. I think with laminated we can deal with that, but I think the main thing is the cleanliness of the cullet. It's just it's free from contamination, really. It isn't simple, I know.
Thanks, Andy. So before you guys mentioned, it's about educating the industry. Someone's asked for a comment, and Jason, this could be for you. So a comment on Arup's retrofit of one Triton Square on a circular/reuse viewpoint. So just to give you a bit of context, most of the existing glass units were still performing, but at 20 years old, their future performance could not be guaranteed. The project team managed to reinstall 3,500 meters squared of reconditioned and re-warranted glass facades using an off-site pop-up workshop.
So what was the question again, James? About
I guess just a general comment on this sort of this case study.
There's certainly a desire in certain architects in the industry to actually try and repurpose glass. I think that is definitely, if you can reuse the existing glass, then you're saving a lot of carbon because you actually reuse and repurposing it. So I think there's definitely merit in doing that. So it's interesting. I'm not completely familiar with the project that Arup's that they're on about, that Arup's been involved with, but I think, yeah, definitely it is certainly something that needs to be looked at, and yeah, repurposing glass is definitely something that needs to be looked at in the future to try and save carbon. Graham, are you familiar with that project, or
yes,
and you've been involved with projects like that as well?
Certainly, and it's something we're asked more often, and we're looking at, because as glass is inert, it doesn't really change. I mean, coatings might get scratched or something, but generally glass as inert material is absolutely fine. It's the seals that fail on an IGU. And that may be because, in fact, it hasn't been installed properly in the overall, aluminium cassette or whatever. But to answer the question, or always from a circularity point of view, the way to expand at least carbon is to reuse the glass that's already been made. So yes, to take out the polysulfide, the spacer bar, to clean it up, and then reapply those materials, you're going to give your building a new lease of life with the least possible amount of added carbon. And so I think that's a really interesting proposal. It does mean that NSG aren't selling any glass, but
I think there's also Graham, there's the coating technology has certainly advanced in the last 20 years.
Yeah,
so the performance of units has increased from a thermal perspective. So
absolutely. So I think, yeah, I mean, these are all aspects that need to be considered in the whole. So when the glass is returned, is it returned with the same, or are we replacing one or two sheets with a new coated surface? So I think all of these things need to be looked in the round, and what the overall quality is. And that's not to say it's from a cost perspective an easy solution, because there's a lot of manual handling there. And I know that there's considerable research being done in this area to automate it, but at the moment it's not quite there yet. So again, it's another interesting part of the research that I'm looking forward to seeing how that goes.
Thank you. Another question for Andy. So just going back to the cullet and what it needs to be put back into the process. So you mentioned with laminate we can deal with it. So the question is, can cullet with PVB be put back into the furnace, and to what level?
Yes, I think it's at what level is the thing, because obviously you've got the carbon associated with the laminate, so there is a limit on how much we can recycle. I think that's really what I'm saying on that. So if all our cullet was coming back laminated, we'd most probably struggle, but I think we can cope with a level of that. So yeah, I think that's it. At the moment, it's, you know, it has to be done on a case by case basis, and depends on the products that you're making as to the amount that you can reuse. I think that's it. So yeah.
Thank you. And then a question that's just come in: can all coated glass be recycled, or are there limitations depending on coating types?
I think in general they can, because the thicknesses of any coatings are just so thin that you can in general do it. But obviously, if it depends what's on it. So obviously, if you've got mirror coatings or whatever with specific back layers on those, which have got particular elements in, we would have to look at those on a case by case basis, I would say. But general coated glass, I think in general we can deal with.
Thank you very much. And that covers all the questions that have been put into the chat. So unless someone's got a very quick question that we can fit in the last 4 minutes, but if not, then I'm tempted to say we can wrap it up there.
Thanks, James. So if you've got any quick questions, fire them in. Other than that, I'd like to thank Graham, Aston, and Andy for joining us. I find the topic absolutely fascinating. I really appreciate your time that you're giving us today, progress that the industry is making, and also an insight into what work is ahead of us all. I think that it's been really, really good to have your input on this topic and this discussion. So thank you all for your time. Thanks for everybody that's joined the webinar. Hopefully you can join us next time, and we'll have some further discussions.